And maybe this is kind of a fun kickoff topic too, is just the measurement tools relative to nutrition science versus other areas of science. I find this one to be very interesting because you have science as a whole where, like if we're building a rocket, the precision required to launch that rocket and have it actually work is very, very precise to the degree you can't have any wiggle room or the thing blows up. Whereas with nutrition, you could never get that level of precision just because of all the confounders and things that kind of would input. So you have to use these less precise tools. But when you actually look at kind of how that plays out with a lot of these things, you just don't need super precise tools the way you would to launch a rocket to get at least a good enough idea of where certain things are heading and begin to kind of make recommendations, or at least have some idea of like, on average, this is probably going to happen if you do that. Or if you do these things, your risk factors increase, and you can start to kind of collect that data and kind of get an idea of like where you're sort of putting yourself. But I think that kind of gets weaponized to a degree because people will take this idea of precision, like rocket science, and try to apply it to nutrition, where that's just going to be a dead end. You could always argue this isn't good enough if you're basing it on that sort of a precise tool.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And it really underscores, biological research in general, but something as diverse as nutritional science, when every single subject, every human is genetically distinct and have all sorts of different factors, their environment, their microbiome, which is a whole other topic that I am happy to chat about all the time. But there's so many different layers of complexity within an individual human, and the methods that we would use to assess, efficacy or benefit of a nutritional intervention often rely on self-reported feedback that it's really hard to tease out even something as, as well accepted as the placebo effect, right? If someone truly believes that something is going to improve how they feel or their quality of life or their energy level, that sometimes comes to fruition. And that's why it's really important to have as many randomized controlled trials as possible, even in a research area that is harder to parse out compared to something like looking at vaccine efficacy. Really, it's a very discrete endpoint compared to something a little bit, more nuanced. Like,
yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think one point within this I want to kind of talk about with that is food frequency questionnaires, because this is one where it definitely it's one of those things where, like, if I ask one person, what's the value of a food frequency questionnaire, I could get them to lay out a scenario in which they're trying to pull data out of this person of what they ate 10 years ago. And then my intuition is going to be like, well, that's garbage. Like, no one's going to remember that. Versus when you actually look at kind of how food frequency questionnaires are generally used, this would be an example, I would say, of like, it can be an imprecise, relatively speaking, imprecise measurement tool, but depending on what you're trying to actually measure with it, it could be relatively accurate. So yeah, food frequency questionnaires probably aren't going to help us figure out what someone ate 10 years ago, but most research isn't using them for that sort of thing. So can you just tell us a little bit, like, how are food frequency questionnaires typically used, and what is their value in kind of kicking things off when we're trying to learn about how a specific way of eating or specific food will actually impact someone's health?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I'll note that in the end, but you're absolutely, something you just noted is how those questions are phrased really impacts how they are responded to. And verbiage and grammar is actually really important in some of those and those modalities, because it can subliminally message or unconsciously message to individuals. But typically a food frequency questionnaire is looking at, the portion sizes, the types of food, the beverages that are being consumed, and usually it's dictated over a specific period of time. Again, you're absolutely right. It's not going to be something in the distant past. You're looking typically within the last month, the last year. And a lot of this is to basically have them detail a finite list based on certain questions that are indicated. And this is going to look at kind of total diet composition, total diet proportions, portion sizes, as well as kind of how those relate to certain risk factors for certain disease states, certain, predominance to a certain disease condition or body condition or things like that. It's also going to look at, are there linkages or correlations between multiple participants, certain foods, certain risk factors, and things like that. Now, the challenges, of course, is the way you phrase it, who's participating, and also people have inherent recall bias, as well as biases when they're trying to report things like portion control. So unless someone is physically supervising, and that would kind of shift that from, a questionnaire-based study to a controlled trial sort of study, people broadly underestimate the quantity of food that they're eating. So if they think they've consumed one portion of, say, we'll go ice cream because I eat ice cream. Say ice cream, in reality, I'm eating 3 or 4 portions, right? So a lot of times it also allows researchers to understand why there might be disparity in outcomes versus inputs, because again, people are saying, well, I used 1 serving of salad dressing. Why am I seeing, I'm not seeing weight loss, for simplicity's sake. And in reality, it's because they're not actually in a calorie deficit, because it's all these secret kind of calorie sources that they didn't fully understand. There's of course a lot of limitations to these, right? Because if someone says, I ate chicken, well, how was it prepared? Was it fried? Did you have oil in it? What else did you add to it? Was there extra sodium? And so there's all these other things that can skew the data, or even can change the data from person to person, or even within the same person from day to day, right? Sometimes maybe that was grilled white meat chicken. Another day it might be, on the bone dark meat chicken with skin, and so unless you have a questionnaire formed in such a precise way that you can really dissect out all of those, there's always going to be a confounding variable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of times it doesn't stop there either, too. It's sort of like points you towards what is worth spending more time exploring. And that's where I think those are probably useful. I just find it interesting that they tend to be, like many of these things, I think, weaponized either in a black and white manner, where it's something where it's like, oh, well, this research study used a food frequency questionnaire, therefore we throw it out before even looking at anything else involved with it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's true with a lot of biomedical sciences, is that, I think there's just a lack of understanding that it's shades of gray, there's nuance, it's not black and white. When you consume something on social media as information, especially if you're just reading the headline, that's very, it's very likely that that's not the full story or the scope of what's being discussed. And so it's really important for people to kind of, look under the hood a little bit and maybe take things with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.